Welcome to the new person on the line. We'll just keep, now this is live streaming on Facebook and on Twitter. And so we've got, hopefully we'll get a few more people that didn't expect to be part of the class today. A lot of people are at home, and we just want as many people to understand the Constitution as possible, because that's so important to us. And so there will be time for Q&A. Classes are very compact today. 9 to 11 is the first class. So there's not gonna be a lot of time for Q&A, but there will. So we're just gonna go ahead and start with, I'm gonna give everybody another couple minutes to join. So just bear with us. If you just joined the call and you want to announce yourself, feel free to. Okay. Well, we're gonna have a lot of people that are just watching this. They may not even join us for the Zoom class, but that's okay. The key is getting people to learn about the Constitution. I'm gonna provide you with everything you need to know to be a good referee. That's what we really need to become, are good referees, and understanding what the Constitution means and how we get our congressmen to obey it. Not just our congressmen, but our state reps, our state senators, our sheriffs, our city councilmen, our county councilmen, and we need to obey it as well, because if we don't understand that we can nullify at the local level. When I say local level, that is the individual level, because we have God-given rights. And these are been declared in the Declaration of Independence. This is the founding document of the United States of America. It's not just the U.S. Constitution. In fact, I would say the Declaration of Independence should be much more important to us as Americans, because welcome, Andy.
Oh,
and if anybody joins in that has video, I'm going to turn their video off just so we let's see here. I'll turn your videos on likely later, but I'm just going to so there aren't many distractions during this Constitution workshop. I just want to do it that way. But anyways, we're going to get started. This is a let's see here. I gotta get this ready to go. This is a Constitution workshop that anybody can teach in America. In fact, I think private schools, public schools should be using this to teach their Constitution classes. It was designed by Robert Brown. Robert Brown was a former field coordinator for the John Birch Society, and he took a lot of time to take information he learned from the John Birch Society and put it into a DVD program. It's not just videos, there's worksheets involved, and I'm going to share those. So if you're part of this on Zoom, I'm going to share the documents so that you have them available so you can review them. And anyways, I'm going to go ahead and share. Let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and share the video with you, and we're going to watch it together. This first one is 41 minutes. Now, this DVD includes the old version of Overview of America. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this to the new version of Overview of America, so you get to watch the new one. If you do attend all 6 classes today, I will send you a certificate that will say that you attended all 6 classes, you've completed the course. So that's extra incentive to be part of all 6. I understand not everybody can be part of all 6, but if you are, I want to send you a certificate so that you're recognized as being one of the people, one of the Americans that's actually gone through the course. So here we go. We're going to get started.
You can fix the pillows, make yourself more comfortable.
Welcome to lecture number 1, The Dangers of Democracy. I find that the title of this lecture alone is sometimes a little bit surprising to people because we are taught that in this nation we have a democracy. We're a democratic form of government. Probably the first place we need to really start with an understanding of the Constitution is with an understanding of what our founding fathers meant when they used certain words. A great quote from Joseph Sobran helps us with this. He says, "One of the great goals of education is to initiate the young into the conversation of their ancestors, to enable them to understand the language of that conversation in all its subtlety." We find that many of the writings of the Founding Fathers, particularly the Federalist Papers, are written in a language that's a little foreign to many of the people in our nation today. It's Old English, it's often very verbose in the way they wrote. It's a little difficult for us to understand. Throughout these 6 lectures, we'll talk about some of the words that our Founding Fathers used and what those words meant to them at that time. In particular, starting with the word democracy versus republic. As we turn in the U.S. Constitution to Article 4, Section 4, it says, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government." You may recall that as we pledge our allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, the next line says, "and to the republic," not a democracy. We were founded as a republic, and it's interesting to find the difference between the two and what the founders were so intent on preventing. They wanted to make sure that we were not a democracy. And I was quite surprised to learn some of the things our founders said. For example, James Madison saying, "A democracy is the most vile form of government." I was raised believing that a democracy was the pinnacle. This was the ideal. This is the best form of government. And yet they had a very different view of this. Probably the best place to go to understand the difference between a democracy and a republic is a video produced by the John Birch Society a few years ago called Overview of America. This was produced by John McManus, the president of the John Birch Society.
The United States of America. Born in 1776, our country is the offspring of a religious-based heritage of liberty under law. Blessed with great natural resources and a pioneer people given to industry and moral discipline, our nation grew to be strong and prosperous and developed the finest governmental system ever devised by man. America soon became known as the refuge of the world's tired, hungry, and poor. Millions left everything in the old world to start over in a land that rewarded initiative and hard work and perseverance. The many millions who didn't come here found comfort and hope in knowing that indeed there was such a bastion of freedom and opportunity, a place where dreams could become reality. Today, our nation appears wealthier and more powerful than ever. New technologies have revolutionized our daily lives. Luxuries once enjoyed only by the rich are commonplace and very affordable. Home ownership is widespread, and our people have the expectation of continued economic growth and prosperity. Yet more and more people are coming to realize that they may prosper materially only for a time because their freedoms are diminishing. The sobering reality is that America has been led far from its praiseworthy beginnings. Our people and businesses groan under a heavy burden of economic, political, and social problems, which are the result of a widespread departure from the fundamental truths that made our nation great. If the United States of America is to endure, citizens far and wide must once again come to understand, embrace, and live by timeless concepts called Americanism. What made America great and set it apart from other lands? Was it natural resources? No, other lands are equally blessed. Was it the people? No, the people who built America came from elsewhere. Was it government planning and wisdom that spurred our nation to such heights? No again. It wasn't what government did that made America great. It was what government was prevented from doing that made the difference. What set America apart from other lands was freedom for the individual. Freedom to work, to produce, to succeed, and especially to keep the fruits of one's labors. America became great precisely because the stifling effect of too much government had been prevented. However, freedom in America was not totally unrestrained. Americans overwhelmingly chose to limit their actions with moral codes such as the Ten Commandments, personal morality, and limited government. It's a combination that characterized America and made it the envy of the world. When our founding fathers decided they'd had enough of British oppression, they broke away and declared independence. They stated as self-evident truth in the Declaration of Independence that men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. In other words, God gave man his rights, and that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in the very next sentence, the founders defined the proper role of government when they stated that to secure these rights, governments are instituted. This is the entire philosophical base of our nation. Here, the government cannot legitimately redistribute the wealth, assume power over the people's lives, and dominate man's existence with oppressive taxation, regulations, and controls. According to the founders, government was to be a negative force, which leaves people alone. Its sole function is to protect citizens from one another and from foreign governments, and especially from their own government itself. The founders did not create a government to be a positive force, to do things for people, to take from some, to give to others. They understood that when a government starts doing something for one citizen, it has to take from another to do so. And in the process, it gains control over both. Britain's rulers didn't accept the Declaration of Independence, so our forefathers had to fight a war to make it stick. By 1783, the war for independence had been won, and British forces were sent back across the sea. But the governmental system at that time was weak. It had no power to settle disputes between the states, nor the power to tax for proper needs, such as national defense. So in 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states met in Philadelphia to revise the system, and they produced an entirely new governmental structure known as the Constitution of the United States. Keeping faith with the thunderous assertions in the Declaration, the Constitution was written to govern the government, not the people, and not the states, each of which was a jealous guardian of its own sovereignty. The founders created a central government with strictly limited powers. This left the states free to compete with one another to be the best state, the one with the least amount of taxation and controls, one where citizens would want to build a business and raise a family. That spirit of competition produced excellence, as honest competition always does. It's important to note that the Constitution wasn't forced on the people. It was sent back to the states for ratification, and several of the founding fathers wrote essays explaining it in an effort to persuade fellow Americans to adopt this new system of government. Some of the essays written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay were collected into a volume known as the Federalist Papers. Those essays provide valuable insights into the intent of the founders in establishing our government. Eventually, all 13 states ratified the Constitution, and then each ratified the first 10 amendments known as the Bill of Rights, further tying the hands of the federal government. These amendments are indeed about rights, but it would have been better had the Bill of Rights been labeled the Bill of Limitations on Government. Why? Because it's vital to realize that the Bill of Rights never gave citizens any rights whatsoever. Its sole purpose was to safeguard God-given rights by limiting government power. The founders even insisted that Congress shall make no law about speech, religion, the press, assembly, the right to petition, the right to keep and bear arms, and so on. These amendments are directed squarely at the federal government, not the individual and not the states. They are like most of the Ten Commandments, which are essentially thou shalt nots. The Bill of Rights says Congress shall not, all the way up to the marvelous 10th Amendment, which says in effect, if we forgot anything, you can't do that either. When Benjamin Franklin exited the Constitutional Convention, he was asked by a woman, "Sir, what have you given us?" His immediate response was, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." Yet most Americans today have been persuaded that our nation's governmental system is a democracy and not a republic. The difference between these two is essential in understanding Americanism and the American system. Before we discuss political systems, however, it's helpful to address the confusion that has been spread about the political spectrum. Many have been led to believe that the political spectrum places groups such as communists on the far left, fascists or dictators on the far right, and political moderates or centrists in the middle. However, a more accurate political spectrum will show government having zero power on the far right to having 100% power on the far left. At the extreme right, there is no government. The extreme left features total government under such labels as communism, socialism, Nazism, fascism, princes, potentates, dictators, kings, any form of total government. Those who claim that Nazis and fascists are right-wing never define their terms. This amounts to spreading confusion. Toward the middle of the political spectrum can be found the type of government limited to its proper role of protecting the rights of the people. That's where the Constitution of the United States is. Those who advocate such a form of government are really constitutional moderates. So let's analyze the basic forms of government. They are monarchy or dictatorship ruled by one, oligarchy ruled by a few, democracy ruled by a majority, republic ruled by law, and anarchy, which is ruled by no one. In discussing these five, we'll see that they can be narrowed down to even fewer. Looking first at monarchy or dictatorship, this form of government doesn't really exist in the practical sense. It's always a group that puts one of its members up front. A king has his council of nobles or earls, and every dictator has his bureaucrats or commissars, the men behind the scenes. This isn't ruled by one, even though one person may be the visible leader. It's ruled by a group. So let's eliminate monarchy, dictatorship, because it never truly exists. Oligarchy, which is ruled by a group, is the most common form of government in all history. And it is the most common form of government today. Most of the nations of the world are ruled by a powerful few, and therefore oligarchy remains. At the other end, we find anarchy, which means without government. Some people have looked over history and found that many of its worst crimes were committed by governments, so they decided that having no government might be a good idea. But this is a mistake, because as the ancient Greeks stated, without law there can be no freedom. Our founding fathers agreed and held that some amount of government is a necessary force in any civilized, orderly society. In a state of anarchy, however, everyone has to guard life, liberty, and property, and the lives of family members. Everyone must be armed, and movement is severely restricted because one's property has to be protected at all times. Civilized people have always hired someone to do the guarding, a sheriff, a police force, or some branch of government. Once law enforcement was in place, the people were freer. They could leave their property, work in the fields, and so on. In short, the proper amount of government makes everyone freer. There are some who advocate anarchy, however, not because they want no government, but because they don't like what they have. They use anarchy as a tool for revolutionary change. The condition of anarchy is very much like a vacuum where something rushes in to fill it. These calculating anarchists work to break down the existing government with rioting, killing, looting, and terrorism. Tragically, the people living in such chaos often go to those best able to put an end to it and beg them to take over and restore order. And who is best able to put an end to the chaos? The very people who started it. The anarchists who created the problem then create a government run by them, an oligarchy, where they have total power. This is exactly what happened in Russia that led to Lenin taking total power, and in Germany, where Hitler's brown shirts created the chaos that brought him to power. But anarchy isn't a stable form of government. It's a quick transition from something that exists to something desired by the power-hungry. It's a temporary condition, and because it isn't permanent, we eliminate it as well. The word democracy comes from two Greek words, demos, meaning people, and kratein, meaning to rule. Democracy, therefore, means the rule of the people, majority rule. This, of course, sounds good, but suppose the majority decides to take away one's home, or business, or children. Obviously, there has to be a limit. The flaw in democracy is that the majority isn't restrained. If more than half the people can be persuaded to want something in a democracy, they rule. What about republic? Well, that comes from the Latin, res meaning thing, and publica meaning public. It means the public thing, the law. A true republic is one where the government is limited by law, leaving the people alone. America's founders had a clean slate to write on. They could have set up an oligarchy. In fact, there were some who wanted George Washington to be their king. But the founding fathers knew history, and they chose to give us the rule of law in a republic, not the rule of a majority in a democracy. Why? Let's demonstrate the difference in the setting of the Old West. Consider a lynch mob in a democracy. 35 horseback riders chase one lone gunman. They catch him, and they vote 35-1 to hang him. Democracy has triumphed, and there's one less gunman to contend with. Now consider the same scenario in a republic. The 35 horseback riders catch the gunman and vote 35-1 to hang him, but the sheriff arrives, and he says, "You can't kill him. He's got his right to a fair trial." So they take the gunman back to town. A jury of his peers is selected, and they hear the evidence and the defense, and they decide if he shall hang. Does the jury even decide by majority rule? No, it has to be unanimous or he goes free. The rights of the government aren't subject to majority rule, but to the law. This is the essence of a republic. Many Americans would be surprised to learn that the word democracy does not appear in the Declaration of Independence or the U.S. Constitution. Nor does it appear in any of the constitutions of the 50 states. The founders did everything they could to keep us from having a democracy. James Madison, rightly known as the father of the Constitution, wrote in essay number 10 of the Federalist Papers, "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths." Alexander Hamilton agreed, and he stated, "We are a republican government. Real liberty is never found in despotism or in the extremes of democracy." And John Adams, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, stated, "Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself." The founders had good reason to look upon democracy with contempt, because they knew that the democracies in the early Greek city-states produced some of the wildest excesses of government imaginable. During that period in Greece, there was a man named Solon who urged creation of a fixed body of law not subject to majority whims. But where the Greeks never adopted Solon's wise counsel, the Romans did. Based on what they knew of Solon's laws, they created the 12 tables of the Roman law and in effect built a republic that limited government power and left the people alone. Since government was limited, the people were free to produce, with the understanding that they could keep the fruits of their labor. In time, Rome became wealthy and the envy of the world. In the midst of plenty, however, the Roman people forgot what freedom entailed. They forgot that the essence of freedom is the proper limitation of government. When government power grows, people freedom recedes. Once the Romans dropped their guard, power-seeking politicians began to exceed the powers granted them in the Roman Constitution. Some learned that they could elect politicians who would use government power to take property from some and give it to others. Agriculture subsidies were introduced, followed by housing and welfare programs. Inevitably, taxes rose and controls over the private sector were imposed. Soon, a number of Rome's producers could no longer make ends meet, and they went on the dole. Productivity declined, shortages developed, and mobs began roaming the streets demanding bread and circuses from the government. Many were induced to trade freedom for security. Eventually, the whole system came crashing down. They went from a republic to a democracy and ended up with an oligarchy under a progression of the Caesars. Thus, democracy itself is not a stable form of government. Instead, it is the gradual transition from limited government to the unlimited rule of an oligarchy. Knowing this, we as Americans are ultimately left with only two choices. We can keep our republic, as Franklin put it, or we will inevitably end up with an oligarchy, a tyranny of the elite. Just as there is widespread confusion regarding political systems, there is similar confusion in the economic arena. All during the 20th century, Americans were led to believe that there was a great struggle going on between capitalism and the communist world. Undoubtedly, a struggle existed, but the real adversaries were rarely identified properly. No discussion about economic systems will make sense without first defining terms. And one of the most basic terms in economics is capital, whose definition is the means of production. To illustrate what capital is, let's consider a very simple economy. On the sands of a small island, a castaway has just washed ashore. He has no food and he's hungry. He searches the island, he finds no berries, coconuts, or anything edible. He goes back into the water and tries to catch fish with his bare hands, but he fails. So he goes back up on shore and he finds a bush. He breaks off a branch, he gnaws at one end to make a sharp tip. Back into the water he goes, and with his spear, he catches fish. His spear is capital. It's the means of production for catching fish. He gave up some of his time and some of his energy to produce something he could not eat, but something that would help him to produce something that he could eat. Capital, therefore, can be tools, machinery, and even a man's handmade spear to catch fish. Such being the case, consider that the communists in the former Soviet Union, as well as in China and Cuba, have always used tools and machinery. Officials there even view people as capital. Therefore, by strict definition, are not communists capitalists? For that matter, isn't everyone a capitalist? And so, is not every economic system a capitalist system? What then is the difference between what the communist system is and what the American capitalist system is supposed to be? The difference is ownership of the capital. Is the system monopolistic, state-controlled capitalism, or is it competitive, free enterprise capitalism? It is between these two opposing economic systems that a battle has always raged. Before we proceed, let's also define free market. Basically, it's a self-regulating system in which all parties are completely free to transact with one another. But where force, fraud, or injury damages one party, the government's role is only to punish those who commit such offenses and to vindicate the rights of the other party. This protects the integrity of the free market, or free enterprise system, without intervening in it. The term private property also needs clarification, for private ownership and control of property is a key component in the free enterprise system. In order for ownership of property to be full and complete, all four of its aspects must be met. These are title, control, use, and the ability to dispose of what a person owns. In a free market economy, these aspects are unrestrained, so long as the owner does not infringe on the legitimate rights and claims of others. True ownership of property and freedom go hand in hand. They always have. Now let's compare the two systems of capitalism. In the competitive free enterprise system, capital or property is both owned privately and controlled privately. In the monopolistic system, holding title to capital can be accomplished privately or by the state. But more importantly, capital is controlled by the state or by the elite few who control the state. The Communist Manifesto, which contains the basic program for all communists and all socialists, explicitly preaches the destruction and abolition of private property. Karl Marx understood the powers of controlling capital, and so have all communists and socialists who have ever looked and still look to Marx as their leader. State-controlled capitalism results in high prices and low quality. After all, why would a monopoly strive to improve if it has no competition? On the other hand, honest, thrifty, and hardworking producers throughout the world prefer a competitive free enterprise system for all. Here, low prices and high quality prevail because a variety of producers will seek to attract the widest amount of customers. Competition results in excellence and always has. Just as the political spectrum shows the range of government power, we can also plot the various economic systems along another spectrum. These forms of government control in the market stand in sharp contrast with a completely free market. In the last century or so, there have been basically 4 forms of state-controlled economies, all on the far left of the economic spectrum: fascism, Nazism, socialism, and communism. In each, the government controls the capital. The difference among these is how much is owned or controlled outright by the government. In a fascist system, the government doesn't own businesses on paper, but it does control them. In Mussolini's Italy, even though he didn't hold title to businesses, he told the owners what to produce, how much to produce, when to produce, where to buy raw materials, who to hire, who to fire, and what price to charge. The rest, he said, was up to them. The fascist system is more efficient than other state-controlled systems insofar as those living under it think they still own their businesses. Shopkeepers concern themselves with maintenance on the machinery, employee relations, painting the building, and so forth. But the government controls owners through an array of taxation and regulations. Under Nazism, which means National Socialism, its proponents went one step further and acquired ownership of some corporations such as Volkswagen. However, Hitler didn't seize ownership of other industrial giants, he simply controlled them, just as Mussolini had controlled businesses in Italy. Socialism is where government officials acquire possession of major industries such as transportation, communications, and utilities in order to leverage control over the entire economy. Through ownership of these vital segments of industry and by creating government regulatory agencies, socialists gain control over virtually everything else. Finally, there is communism, the granddaddy of all in the economic sense. In a way, communism is more honest than fascism because all of the capital is owned and controlled by the state. There are no pretenses about it. Now let's combine political and economic systems because ultimately one never exists without the other. We see again that there are only 2 ultimate choices: a competitive free enterprise system in a republic or a monopolistic state control system under an oligarchy. A moral people have always been a vital element of America's strength. The Founding Fathers well understood the biblical teaching that righteousness exalteth a nation. They also knew that expecting a free market economy and limited government under a republic to endure without morality was expecting the impossible. James Madison cautioned that limited government alone was inadequate for our nation. And John Adams observed, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." George Washington stated, "Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." Yet there are people today who think that liberty is license and that morality is unimportant or irrelevant to politics and economics. But as Benjamin Franklin added, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. The alternative to Americanism is what has condemned most of the human race to live as slaves throughout the millennia. It is the idea that rights are privileges dispensed by an oligarchy according to the unlimited rule of men, that the state should control or own the nation's capital with all economic activity directed from a central power, and that morality is inconsequential, and that security is preferred over freedom and opportunity. Our nation continues to be steered off course, and the principles that led to America's greatness are being cast aside. The simple question for us is, do we continue the slide away from our nation's founding principles, or do we return to the kind of government we inherited? Time is running out for Americans who sense that something is wrong. They have to decide what kind of a country we shall leave for future generations. All that is needed is for a sufficient number of Americans to get involved in the fight for freedom and to return our nation to less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world.
Okay, so that's the new version of America. I'm gonna go ahead and let's see here. If I can go back to the workshop DVD that's available on YouTube here, and I'm going to go ahead and fast forward it. So if you're just jumping on this, we're watching The Dangers of Democracy. The first DVD that comes with the Constitution is the Solution Workshop. And since the old overview of America is the video that's played within that first DVD, we played the new version that's available on YouTube. And so we're skipping ahead to the end of the first lecture. So bear with me.
Well, thank you to John McManus for that great explanation of the difference between a democracy and a republic, where clearly a republic is a permanent form of government, whereas a democracy must inevitably fall into, as he put it, an oligarchy of the elite. Sometimes we find that people have a difficult time letting go of the word democracy in describing our form of government. Personally, I never use democracy to describe our government, not even in a combination like democracy or a democratic republic or even a representative democracy or anything of that nature. It always leads to confusion. Now, there are some elements in our form of government that are in common with democracy. As this slide illustrates, the concept of majority rule is in common in both a constitutional republic as well as a democracy. The difference, though, is what restrains them. In a true democracy, as demonstrated in the video, majority rule rules. There's nothing to stop it. Whereas in a constitutional republic, it is that constitution which prevents the government from doing things that the majority may wish, including trampling minority rights. So it's essential that we understand that in our constitutional republic, there are some things our government is not allowed to do and follow the Constitution. The next place I want to go is a booklet also produced by John McManus entitled A Republic If You Can Keep It. There are a number of additional quotes that help us understand a broader picture of the dangers of democracy. First, as we go to page 5, we have England's Duke of Northumberland. Back in 1931, he warned, "The adoption of democracy as a form of government by all European nations is fatal to good government, to liberty, to law and order, to respect for authority, and to religion." He goes on, "and must eventually produce a state of chaos from which a new world tyranny will arise." He was concerned that Europe adopting democracy would lead to chaos. Now today, How are those democracies working out for Europe? Over the last few years, we've seen Europe on the verge of economic collapse. And our next quote will point to exactly why. This one, found on page 7, near the top of the page, we have Alexander Fraser Tytler, a famous Scottish historian from the 18th century, where he warns a democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves money from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates promising the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that a democracy always collapses over loose fiscal policy, always followed by a dictatorship. What are the challenges that Europe is facing today? Their loose fiscal policy is leading to financial collapse, exactly as he was describing. Their adoption of democracy has led them to the collapse they're facing today. Now, not everyone is opposed to democracy. There are some who speak favorably of democracy. You'll find lower on page 7 and on to page 8, Mao Zedong. He is the famous communist dictator of China, talking about democracy in a favorable manner. He says, "The democratic revolution is the necessary preparation for the socialist revolution. And the socialist revolution is the inevitable sequel to the democratic revolution." What's he saying? If we have a democratic revolution, it will inevitably lead to a socialist revolution. Therefore, obviously, because he loves to promote socialism, a form of Marxism, he's promoting democracy, because democracy will inevitably lead to socialism. When we see, like we have recently in Europe again, democratic revolutions, that's a red flag to me, because it never leads to a freer people. Eventually, it leads to their collapse. Another that spoke in favor of democracy, we have Woodrow Wilson. An article he wrote called Socialism and Democracy, he's comparing the two and how similar socialism and democracy really are. Prior to being President Wilson, in 1887, he points out, state socialism proposes that all idea of a limitation of public authority by individual rights be put out of view, and that state consider itself bound to stop only at what is unwise or futile. What's he saying? Government power shouldn't be limited in order to protect the rights of the people. He's saying the only limit on government power should be what they feel is unwise or futile. Of course, they're the ones that will judge that. That's the vision of state socialism. It's only limited by their own good judgment. That's a little scary. Then next, he demonstrates how democracy and socialism are almost identical. He says, in fundamental theory, socialism and democracy are almost, if not quite, one and the same. They both rest at the bottom upon the absolute right of the community to determine its own destiny and that of its members. Men as communities are supreme over men as individuals. What he's referring to here as the rights of a community trump individual rights. This goes back to the video we watched earlier, that majority rule can trample minority rights. What the will of the majority wants can trump your God-given, unalienable rights that we talk about in the Declaration of Independence. Later, when he became president, promoting democracy, he says in 1916, he appealed to our nation to enter World War I to make the world safe for democracy. It shouldn't be surprising that it was during the Wilson administration that our nation began to think of itself as a democracy rather than a republic. The word democracy started to have widespread use across our country, convincing us that truly we can do whatever we want as long as the majority goes along with it. So making the world safe for democracy. Next, we have in 1940 President Franklin Roosevelt declaring that America must be the great arsenal of democracy, again protecting the idea of democracy around the world. And more recently, in 2003, we have President Bush, who portrayed the war in Iraq as the latest front in the global democratic revolution led by the United States. Now that should be a huge red flag that when we see a democratic revolution, what does a democratic revolution inevitably lead to? Socialist revolution. When we have a global democratic revolution that we're promoting, are we not promoting socialism? In the eyes of Mao Zedong, that's exactly what we were doing. Now, President George Bush also spoke of the war as an effort to spread democracy. Now, with this new understanding of democracy, I began to realize that spreading democracy is not such a good thing after all. It leads people to a socialist state and to collapse, like we're seeing in Europe today. So with that, we have a solemn warning that we are not a democracy, we are a republic. And from that foundation, we'll begin our study of the U.S. Constitution, the limits of power that the government is supposed to be following. Thank you for joining us for lecture number 1.
Okay, everybody, we're going to go into our Q&A session here. So if you are called in, then you can join in this. If you're watching this on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, because they're all posted live right now on my Facebook page, my Twitter page, and my YouTube page, you can dial into this conversation by dialing. So get a pen and paper out if you don't have one already. 929-205-6099. Again, that's 929-205-6099. When you call in, you need to type in the meeting ID. That's 964-139-4137. Again, that's 964-139-4137. And you can see that number by going to my Facebook page. My name's Evan Mulch. Again, that's Evan Mulch, EVANMULCH. Okay, so I'm going to unmute everybody, and we're going to go into the Q&A session. So just so everybody knows, you're off of mute now. And let's see here. And just so everybody knows that watching this, I am a John Birch Society field coordinator, which means my social media reach is likely shadow banned in some way. And so the way you can help me out is by sharing, going to my Facebook page, going to my Twitter page, sharing what I've posted, and that will get more people onto this video, because this is really important to Americans, especially right now with what's going on. We are experiencing a great bit of tyranny due to martial law. I mean, we are being told we can't go to areas where there's more than so many people, and this is not a pandemic we're experiencing. This is a there is a virus going around, but it's not a pandemic by any means. And so this information is more important than ever for people to understand. And so if you're watching this, I'm going to share this page with you real quick. Lecture 1, questions. You should all be able to see that. I'll try to zoom in a little bit more so it's easy for you to see on your computer. Oh, there we go. Question 1. It wasn't what the government did that made America great. It was what blank, blank, blank that made the difference. Does anybody want to answer that question?
Our founding fathers?
Close. The answer is prevented from doing. It wasn't what government did that made America great. It was what government was prevented from doing that made the difference.
Right.
And that's really important. In fact, John McManus is the man that made that overview of America video. That's his voice. And what he did, he told me, he had the opportunity to send a message to President Trump. And that was the message he sent to President Trump. It wasn't what government did that made America great. It was what government was prevented from doing that made the difference. Okay, going on to question, and there are no wrong answers. This is not a graded quiz. I want participation. So everybody that's on the line, please participate if you can. The founders did not create a government. This is question number 2. The founders did not create a government to do things for people, to take from some to give to others. They understood that when a government starts doing something for one citizen, it has to take from another to do so. And in the process, it
Makes slaves of both. Makes slaves of both?
very close, gains control of both. Same thing though, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Question 3, the Constitution was written to govern blank, blank, not the people and not the states.
Say it.
Somebody said the government. I heard them say that.
Yep.
Right?
I have a Thai student here with me watching this. My student from Thailand.
Well, the Thai.
That was his answer.
Your student is getting them right. Way to go.
My student is very smart.
Well, we need him or her.
Him.
Okay, we need him to stay in America because he is blowing it out of the park right now. So we're thankful for his help. Here we go. The founders, I should have said hitting it out of the park. I want him to know the correct wordage. Hitting it out of the park. That's what we say in America. The founders created a central government with strictly. I'm sorry, we're already there. Let's see here. Oh, no, we haven't done that one yet. The founders created a central government with strictly blank blank. This left the states free to compete with one another to be the best state, the one with the least amount of taxation and controls, one where citizens would want to build a business and raise a family. The answer to that, does anybody want to guess?
Limited government.
Limited powers. Good job, Andy. That counts. Number 5, James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton wrote essays explaining the Constitution to encourage the people to support adopting this new form of government. These essays were collected into a volume known as the
Federalist Papers.
Both of you got it right. Great job. You don't have the answers, do you?
Nope.
No, nobody has the answers. I didn't think so, but here we go. Great job. Okay, number 6, draw a line connecting the form of government to the proper definition. We can't draw a line here, but we're going to, what is a monarchy? And you have to pick one of the terms on the right side.
Rule by one.
Rule by one. What is an oligarchy?
Rule by few.
There you go, rule by few. What is a democracy?
Rule by a
Rule by majority.
There you go, rule by. What is a republic? There you go. The stuff.
Oh, right found.
You have a smart young man with you, Peggy. Wow. Anarchy. What is that?
Rule by no one.
Rule by no one. Okay. 7, the rights of the gunman aren't subject to majority rule, but to the law. This is the essence of
A republic.
Hey, good job. The essence of freedom is the proper
Rule.
limitation of government. So close. The essence of freedom is the proper limitation on government. And that's what we have in America if we are to get our congressmen and representatives to obey the US Constitution. We have the proper limit on government if it's obeyed, right?
That's right.
Number 9, knowing this, we as Americans are ultimately left with only 2 choices. We can keep our blank, as Franklin put it, or we will inevitably end up with an blank, a tyranny of the elite.
Republic.
Republic is, no, democracy is not the second one. What's a tyranny of the elite? Oligarchy. Yep.
Yeah.
Number 10, blank is the means of production.
Capital.
Yeah, there you go. Capital is the means of production. 11, in order for ownership of property to be full and complete, all 4 of its aspects must be met. These are?
You have to own it.
Ownership.
You able to give it away.
Ownership,
Use.
which could be called title. Yeah.
Title, use,
Use, yeah, use is one.
That's right.
ability to transfer it or sell it.
Ability to dispose, yeah, and
dispose.
one more, which could be under ownership. So the answer is title, control, use, and ability to dispose.
That's right.
That's what ownership of property is. That's what makes America great, is that we have ownership of property. Unless you own a restaurant in South Carolina right now, you cannot use your property because tyranny is set in. But we still have God-given rights to our property, so we just got to remind people of that. Number 12. State-controlled capitalism results in blank blank and blank blank. State-controlled capitalism results in blank blank and blank blank. This is tough. State-controlled capitalism results in high prices and low quality.
That's right.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Number 13. Benjamin Franklin cautioned, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of rulers or masters. Masters is the correct word. And that's what we're seeing now, aren't we?
Yep.
All over the world right now.
No doubt.
Number 14, Scottish historian Alexander Tytler warned, quote, a democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can blank
Vote.
themselves
Vote.
money. Vote, yeah, you're right, vote themselves money from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidate promising the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that a democracy always collapses over loose fiscal policy, always followed by a
Dictatorship.
dictatorship. Number 15, Chinese dictator Mao Zedong candidly admitted the democratic revolution is the necessary preparation for the blank revolution.
Socialist.
And socialist revolution, yes. And the blank revolution is the inevitable sequel to the democratic revolution.
Socialist.
Yes, same answer, socialist.
That
So
guy's smart. I want
socialist-
him on my team. Him and
we're
Bob.
all on the same team here. We're on the Birch team. So way to go. And I've got a discussion question here. President George W. Bush told us that we must go to war in Iraq and Afghanistan to spread democracy. Where is this international spreading of the democracy likely to lead?
Dictatorship.
Mm-hmm. Socialism.
Communism.
And those areas already had, they were already under dictatorships, but what should we be spreading? If we ever go to war with a country and we win, what should we spread afterward?
Americanism.
Yeah, there you go. We should spread
Yes.
Americanism. We should create constitutional republics.
Yes.
That's the answer. We shouldn't spread democracies. How crazy are we to have spent trillions of dollars spreading democracies? We're not getting anywhere, are we?
But
In
we
fact,
know
we're
it's
creating-
good for us.
We're creating more enemies, aren't we?
Yes.
Okay, we're gonna move on to DVD 2. So go ahead and stretch out a little bit. All right, everybody stretch out. There we go. All right. And if you would, if you're on social media watching this, share this, because a John Birch Society coordinator does not have much reach on social media because Facebook and Twitter do not like John Birch Society coordinators. And so you gotta help me out, share this video if you're watching it. This is live. We're going on for another hour, and then we will be switching. We will be starting again at 1 o'clock today. And so anyways, if you're watching this now, we're advancing to DVD 2. I'm going to make everybody watching this, if you do stick with this, you're going to be a constitutional expert by the time you're done. That's really what we need in America right now. And I will make you a constitutional expert. You do not need to go to law school to become a constitutional expert. In fact, law schools will teach you the wrong way on how to interpret the Constitution. This is the way you do it. So please stick with us throughout today. And I will send certificates to those that finish the course. So that is my promise to you. At the end of the day, I will send certificates to those that do finish the course.
Oh, boy.
Give me just a second here. I'm going to mute everybody again.
Oh.
I think I shared the wrong video. Hold on here just a second here. Yeah, I think I did it right. Okay, let me try this again.
Enumerated versus
Okay, we'll start this over here.
Welcome to class number 2. The title for this class is Enumerated versus Unlimited Power. What we want to talk about today is what it is our founding fathers gave us with the U.S. Constitution. Was it designed to empower a federal government that has limitless power, or one that was...
Okay, I hope I'm playing the right video here. I'm going to test it out here on my phone to make sure it's... Oh yeah, it is playing. Okay, we're good.
Limited to few powers, and what the original intent of the Constitution was. So to begin with, I want to start off with a quote here from Thomas Jefferson, where he declares what his view on this question really was. Congress has not unlimited powers, but only those specifically enumerated. Now the question I would ask is, if they're specifically enumerated, where would those be enumerated? Kind of an obvious question. That would be in the U.S. Constitution. That would be where we would look for that specific enumeration. Now, I want to talk about this concept first before we go much deeper, the concept of enumerated powers. What does the word enumerated mean? Well, it comes from the same root word as number does. Numbered, specifically listed. That means that these powers aren't just something that's implied or vague. They are specific. There's a list of them we can find in the Constitution, which we'll be spending some time on. I want to use an analogy today, though. Some of you have probably had the experience of taking a car into the auto shop. Let's say you take your car into the auto shop to have the brake pads changed. And when you come back the next day to pick up your car, you can't find your car. They assure you it's up in the northwest corner of the parking lot and you can't find it. Finally, they lead you over and, oh no, this is not my car was blue. They said, well, we noticed you had a number of chips in the paint. We took the liberty to repaint your car for you. Now it's red. And not only that, you notice on closer inspection you have a new car stereo system, a very nice, expensive one, but however your bill reflects all of this as well. And yet further inspection reveals that your brake pads were never changed. The problem is you made the mistake of taking your car to the U.S. Congress auto shop because, like Congress today, this auto shop is taking upon themselves numbers of powers that we never gave them. And then they're also neglecting the things they're supposed to be doing for us. If you then said to your auto mechanic, what gave you the idea that you could do this to my car? And they respond, well, you never said we couldn't. Does that fly? Clearly not. We all understand that when you take your car into the auto shop, you fill out a work order, please change brake pads. That is an enumerated power list. Anything on the list they can do, and if while they're changing your brake pads, they notice that your wheel bearings are going out. Do they just change out your wheel bearings? Of course not. They give you a call. Say, we noticed this. Would you like to grant us a new enumerated power? That's not the way they say it, but that is what they're asking. And if you approve them to change out your wheel bearings as well, that's on their list now of enumerated powers. The same thing works for Congress. If it's on the list, they can do it. If it's not on the list, but they feel it's necessary, they can certainly request to the people, please grant an amendment to the Constitution granting new power. But otherwise, if it's not on the list, they don't have the power. Now, can you imagine for a moment if we were to trim back the federal budget to fit within those enumerated powers? That'd mean we'd trim the federal budget by 80%. Do you think we could balance the budget? I think we could quite easily balance the budget and have a surplus and do something we haven't done for many years. That means pay off the national debt. That's really what we need to be doing, and I think this is the only way we could ever do so, is if we were to get our federal government to rein itself back in, or we rein it in, to fit within the bounds prescribed by the Constitution. Now, I want to draw your attention to this handout called U.S. Constitution Roadmap. It's like a table of contents. The legislative department is the entire first page, Article 1. As you turn over to the back side, you see Article 2, the executive department, Article 3, judicial department. Notice how much smaller those are than the powers of Congress. Congress takes up the entire half of this whole document. And that's about how it works out in the U.S. Constitution as well. The section that describes how Congress shall function and what their powers are and their limits and so on is roughly half of the U.S. Constitution, which gives you an idea of who of the three branches has the most power, that is Congress. And we'll illustrate that a little bit later on in today's lecture. The next thing I want to point out is on this front side, the largest section in Article 1 is this white one. Notice how it goes Article 1, and then there's Section 8, which is Congress, powers granted to Congress. And then in Section 8, there's 18 clauses. Article, section, and clause is the way the Constitution is laid out. It's very much like in the Bible where you have book, like the book of Matthew, and then chapter 1 and verse 1. Article, section, and clause is very much like book, chapter, and verse. Now, this largest section is the list of powers. This is the enumerated powers of Congress in Section 8. That's the list of powers that they can legislate on. They can make laws on any of the things on these 18 clauses, and only that. And if it's not on that list, they don't have the power. Now, in the U.S. Constitution itself, the very first line after the preamble, if you have your pocket Constitution with you, in this version it's on page 11. Right after the preamble, we find Article 1, Section 1, and Clause 1. The very first thing it defines is this: all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in Congress. What's legislative power? Legislative power is lawmaking. Lawmaking power. So all power to make laws is given to whom? Go ahead. Congress. All power to make laws given to Congress. Now here's your quiz. If any of you are good at math, you may remember those if-then questions. If all legislative power is in Congress, then how much power is left over for the president to legislate, to write new laws?
None.
None. You're sure about that? Does he ever legislate? Unfortunately, yes. Frequently. And we're not just talking about our current president, but virtually every president in my lifetime, and probably quite a long time before, have legislated without Congress being involved. They write an executive order and sign it, and this is a new law. That violates the very first line after the preamble of the Constitution. For the president to write law himself, he's taking the power of one of the other two branches, which was clearly defined for Congress and Congress only. That's a usurpation of power. Now, again, this if-then question, the next one is, if all legislative power is in Congress, how much legislative power is left to the Supreme Court? None? You're sure? Do they ever legislate?
Yes.
Again, unfortunately, they do. A classic example is Roe versus Wade, which hundreds of years of history were suddenly diverted in a different direction by a ruling of the Supreme Court. And as we're told today, Roe versus Wade, legalizing abortion, is settled law. If Roe versus Wade is settled law, Who wrote the law? It wasn't the legislature, it wasn't Congress, was it? It was the Supreme Court. So in that way, that clearly violates the very first line of the Constitution. If we just followed this much of the Constitution, a major portion of what's going on in our nation would stop, because the president is legislating quite actively, as is the Supreme Court. This would rein in.
Keep in mind, everybody, that when Robert Brown created this video, Barack Obama was president at that time, because this is a video that was not made. It was made, I think, about 10 years ago. But anyways, I wanted to let you know while we're playing this video.
In a good portion of that. Now, the next part I want to focus on is the phrase herein granted. All legislative powers herein granted. The point is, all the legislative powers that were herein granted in that part we just covered, Article 1, Section 8, clauses 1 through 18, that's where it is herein granted. And any that is not herein granted, well, then the 10th Amendment applies. The powers that are not delegated to the United States by this Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. What does that mean? If it's not on this list, that power does not belong to the federal. It belongs to either the states or to the people. Now, in some cases, some things are prohibited to the states. You'll find that primarily in Article 1, Section 10. There's a list. It says, no state shall, no state shall, no state shall, all throughout Article 1, Section 10. We'll go into some of those a little bit later in Lecture 3 in particular, no state shall section. So some things, it's not appropriate for the federal nor the state governments to be doing. Some powers are reserved only to the people. Some things are not appropriate for government to be involved in at all. That is probably the simplest description of constitutionalism 101 I could give you. Only Congress can legislate. Congress can only legislate on those enumerated powers found in Article 1, Section 8. And anything else is a power left to the states or to the people. If everyone understood that much of what our federal government's involved in, it would not be. So considering the fact that our federal government has stepped far beyond the bounds prescribed by the Constitution, it's become popular lately. Many states have started pushing forward for nullification type bills. What nullification is simply on a state level is when a state stands up and says, we do not recognize the authority of the federal government to legislate in this area. It's not in their jurisdiction, therefore we are not going along with it. Very simple concept. But there's been a lot of concern about this. The media has certainly done their share of warning people against it. And I'd say probably one of the most common excuses or reasons for fearing nullification was expressed by a governor of one of the western states recently when he said this: we can't have the states picking and choosing which laws they want to obey. That would lead to anarchy. And you know, there is some truth to that. I have to admit, if the states were simply to pick and choose which laws they like that come from the federal government, then the federal really has no real power. From lecture number 1, you might remember there was a chart on the screen where it showed kind of a big wedge. Over on this side, 0% government, and on the far other side is 100% government. And 0% government being anarchy, 100% government being any form of a totalitarian state with all power in the government. And that our U.S. Constitution was really the balance between those two. That too little government leads to chaos, but too much government causes problems as well. We want to make the government strong enough to protect our rights, but not strong enough to abuse us in the process. Now, prior to the U.S. Constitution, we were living under the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation, they concluded, were too close to this side of anarchy. They didn't have enough real power to do the jobs we gave them to do. For example, we gave our Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, the responsibility to raise an army to fight for our independence from Great Britain. And yet they had no power to tax. They could request tax money from the states, but they couldn't enforce it. And because of that, that alone, among many other reasons, but that alone nearly cost us the war, because they couldn't raise the money to fund the war. And what they finally resorted to was just printing the money, print more and more of the continental dollars, and we'll talk about that a little in Lecture 3 as well. But you can see the problem. If the federal has no real power and the states can truly pick and choose, yes, that would be a problem. And yet on the other end of the spectrum, are the states required to go along with anything the federal government says, no matter what? If that were the case, then we truly have an unlimited government. Whether they're within their bounds of the Constitution or not, we go to the other end of that spectrum, we end up in tyranny. And so, where do we draw the line? Is there a clear line we can draw between what is appropriate for the states to go along with whether they like it or not, and what is appropriate for them to nullify? And of course, I would say yes, the answer is the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is very clear and defining on what those laws can be and what they cannot be. There is one other excuse that I see for staying away from nullification, and that is, in the last legislative session, we had a state legislator who proposed a number of nullification-type bills, saying the federal government has no authority in this realm, so we will not be observing this law, or something of that nature. And of course, he portrayed himself as a strong constitutionalist. And the national media picked this up. He got national attention for it. And they said, apparently his love for the Constitution does not extend to the Supremacy Clause. So that's the other one, is the Supremacy Clause. It's found in Article 6, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And here's what they want you to believe it says. This is not what it says. This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be passed by Congress, that's the part that they don't want you to know what it really says, shall be the supreme law of the land. So what this is implying is any law that's passed by Congress is the supreme law of the land, regardless of whether or not it's on the list of enumerated powers. If they pass it, it's constitutional and supreme. But a simple reading of the Constitution resolves this question. Because Article 6, Clause 2 doesn't say that. It says this Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof shall be the supreme law of the land. Made in pursuance thereof. And by the way, on your class handout, that is answer to question number 1. There's a fill in the blank. Made in pursuance thereof is your first answer. Now, what does that mean? Made in pursuance thereof, thereof meaning referring back to the Constitution. Pursuance of the Constitution. What does it mean to pursue? To follow? Closely follow? So to have a law that is made in pursuance of the Constitution literally means that that law is in following or in keeping with the Constitution, the powers granted by the Constitution. Now, what does this imply about laws that are not made in pursuance thereof? If laws made in pursuance of the Constitution are supreme, then laws not made in pursuance are not supreme, right? In fact, Marbury versus Madison, a Supreme Court ruling, declared all laws which are repugnant, in conflict with the Constitution, are null and void. They're not laws at all. So this is directly contrary to what the media was saying about this state legislator. Apparently his love for the Constitution does extend to the Supremacy Clause because only those laws made in pursuance thereof are supreme. And all other laws are not laws at all. Now this brings us to the oath of office. All of our state legislators and governors swear an oath of office to what? Well, this seems to be what so many of them think they have sworn. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will be subject and subservient to the federal government, and that I will support and defend all laws passed by Congress or the Supreme Court or the President, never questioning their authority to legislate in all matters whatsoever. That seems to be what they feel like they're supposed to be doing. Whatever the federal government does, we must comply with. That's not what their oath said. The oath of office, whether it's a federal oath or a state oath or whatever, all elected officials and people appointed to various positions of government, even our military, police, sheriffs, and so on, they're required to swear an oath, something of this nature. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, it's those domestic ones in particular that I'm concerned about. Ancient Rome and the ancient Roman Republic never fell to an external power until they first crumbled internally. And we will be the same. And so it's those domestic ones first that we need to worry about. Now, a simple test. I always like to make things as simple as possible. If you want to understand what really is constitutional and what is not, when someone's bringing forth an interpretation of here's what the Constitution means, remember this simple test that I'm about to give you. It comes from two quotes from our founding fathers. First, James Madison in Federalist number 45. Now, the Federalist Papers, as a quick side note, was a list of 85 letters to the editor, really, written by James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton. These letters were written to the papers of the state of New York to help the people of New York understand this Constitution that was being proposed, to encourage them to go along with it and encourage their state to ratify it. So the Federalist Papers is probably the greatest single source of what was the original intent of the Constitution. It's the greatest authority on that topic. Now, Federalist number 45, James Madison points out, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are vague, undefined. No, few and defined. Just the opposite of vague. They're few and they are defined. That means they're clear. The other quote here from Thomas Jefferson says, to take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, not longer susceptible of any definition. The two phrases I want you to remember now are few and defined and boundless fields of power. That's the test. This interpretation that someone's sharing with you, this is what the Constitution means. By that interpretation, can we justify boundless fields of power? Or by that interpretation, is that a narrow, few, and defined understanding of the powers? And we'll repeat this test a few times today. So that's where we are today. I want you to always remember this enumerated powers versus a boundless field of power. Few and defined or boundless powers. That's our simple test we'll be applying to the Constitution. Now, contrary to this, the Attorney General between 1941 and 1945, a man by the name of Francis Biddle, he gives us his interpretation of how to interpret the Constitution. The government of the United States can do anything not specifically prohibited by the Constitution. Does that sound like few and defined or boundless power? Boundless power. That sounds like our auto mechanic, doesn't it? How big would the work order have to be when you take your car in to list everything you don't want them to do specifically? Please don't change my left or right headlights. Please don't change the dome light. Please don't change out the fourth lug nut on the front right wheel. And the work order would have to be huge. In the same way, how big would the Constitution have to be if we listed what they could not do rather than the few powers we were actually giving them? It wouldn't be this size, I tell you that. It'd probably be a lot more like the size of most of the bills they're passing today, where it takes reams of paper to print it. And no one would know what it said, and no one would be able to read it. Wisely, they chose to simply list those few powers you do have, and if it's not on the list, you can't do it. So he's clearly reading the Constitution in reverse. And of course, Congressman Pete Stark, just to bring things to modern day, this concept, this idea still persists. In this country, the federal government can do pretty much whatever it wants to. Yet again, boundless or few and defined. That's clearly boundless power, isn't it? Now, I want to bring things down to a very simple description. There's really 5 places in the Constitution that are frequently exploited and stretched beyond their original intent to find unlimited power. The first one we've already covered, that being the Supremacy Clause. Whatever is passed by Congress is supreme and you must comply. The other 4 consist of the General Welfare Clause. You've probably heard that used before. Found in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. We'll go into that one next. But the rest of the list, number 3 is the Necessary and Proper Clause. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. Frequently also known as the Elastic Clause, because this one you can just stretch to fit any power you could imagine into it. Or also the Implied Powers Clause, it's also known as. Number 4, the Interstate Commerce Clause. This one's had a fair amount of popularity and publicity lately, because it's the one that our national health care law is justified by, we're told. This is why they can do this new law. Found in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. We'll go into that one as well, and then we'll conclude with treaty law. So let's start with number 2 now, the General Welfare Clause. Here's what it does say. Congress shall have power, and then the ... is various ways of raising money. So Congress shall have power to raise money to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare. That's the only 3 things Congress can spend money on: pay debts, provide for the common defense, and general welfare. Now that has been taken to mean, especially the general welfare, that Congress can do anything it wants to as long as it's for the general good. Not at all what was originally intended. We'll demonstrate that. First of all, James Madison again declares if Congress can do whatever in their discretion can be done by money and will promote the general welfare, then the government is no longer a limited one. He's using our same test, isn't he? Is this limited government, few and defined, or boundless fields of power? He's saying, if that's the interpretation, we're talking about boundless power. We do not have limited government. And yet that is the popular understanding of that clause today, as wrong as it may be. Thomas Jefferson again points out, Congress has not unlimited powers to provide for the general welfare, but only those specifically enumerated. Specifically enumerated? The powers of general welfare are specifically enumerated? Well, yes, they are. In fact, that's about half of what's in Article 1, Section 8. I'll show you that in just a moment. One more quote from James Madison, and then we'll get into it. He says, nothing is more natural nor common than to first use a general phrase and then to explain and qualify it by a recital of particulars. In other words, to introduce your topic, such as I'm writing a research paper on trees. I start off with the statement, the general phrase, trees are good. Then I'll recite some particulars such as trees are good for shade, trees are good for wood, trees are good for the environment, for animals to live in, trees are good for helping have more oxygen in the air, and so on. Those are the recital particulars. Start with a general phrase and then give the specifics afterwards. That's exactly how Article 1, Section 8 is written. It starts off with at the top, Clause 1, the very first line in Article 1, Section 8. And if you want to follow along, this is on page 17 in your pocket Constitution. It starts off with, the Congress shall have power to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and the general welfare. And then the next 9 clauses, borrow money, regulate commerce, establish rules of naturalization and laws on bankruptcies, coin money, punish counterfeiting, establish post offices, post roads, promote science and useful arts by protecting exclusive right, that being like patents and that type of thing, constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court, and then you jump all the way to the very end, 17, which is the second to last, which is the power to control land for limited purposes. Those are general welfare powers, and the reason I categorize these ones as general welfare is because everything else in Article 1, Section 8 is common defense. That's the 2 categories listed at the beginning, isn't it? To provide for the common defense and general welfare. That's our general phrase at the top, common defense and general welfare. And then here's the specific powers of common defense on this side and general welfare on that side. But all the powers fall into one of these 2 categories. Now, a year or so ago, I was grilling a congressman on his voting record. I like to do that type of thing myself. Asking him, where in the Constitution did you feel you had the authority granted to take our tax dollars and give it away to the governments of foreign nations, what's known as foreign aid? And I don't care what government we're talking about, where in the Constitution is it granted? And he said, well, that would depend on which foreign aid. In some cases, it would be under the General Welfare Clause, and some of it would be under the Common Defense Clause. My response to him was, well, I understand very well, I'm very familiar with the general welfare powers. They are specifically listed in clauses 2 through 9 and 17. Which one of those are you talking about? And while we're on the topic, the common defense powers, clauses 10 through 16, are specifically enumerated. Which one of those do you feel grants the power for foreign aid? This was on Facebook where he was campaigning for re-election. It was his campaign page. He deleted my question. and then blocked me from asking any further questions. So I guess he didn't like the direction this was going. But do you see the point? You can't use the Common Defense Clause or the General Welfare Clause as an excuse for power if it's not listed in the specifics thereafter. That is the general welfare powers. This is the common defense powers. It's very clear. And that is all that the common defense or general welfare grants. Now, the next one, excuse number 3, the elastic clause, also known as the necessary and proper clause. Here's what it does say. The Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. A few years ago, a friend of mine used this one with me. I was telling him his U.S. Senator that he loves so much doesn't tend to follow the Constitution very well. And he asked for some specifics. I gave him some. He says, oh, well, that's under the necessary and proper clause. Would you mind reading that with me, I say? Sure, and this is what he read. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. And that sounds like few and defined powers or boundless. That does sound pretty boundless, and that is what it says. Do we have a problem here? Well, no. If you read it in context, the only problem is we didn't finish reading. In fact, if anyone ever uses this one with you, just ask them to read the next 7 words. You can read on if you'd like, but the next 7 words really clarify it because it says, for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. What is that talking about? Congress has power to make all laws that shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Let me show you where this appears in the Constitution. Right here at the bottom. You have Article 1, Section 8, the heading up there, the specific powers of general welfare, common defense, and then the conclusion, the necessary and proper clause. And it says they have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, these powers that came before it. It's referring to this list of powers, isn't it? So if that's referring to this list of powers, either common defense powers or general welfare powers, does that give any new power? It doesn't. It clearly doesn't. In fact, my friend, when I shared this with him, would you mind reading the next 7 words? He read that and said, oh. And that was it. Let's go on to a new topic. And I think that's all we need to do on this particular excuse. You just read it in context. It resolves that for you very nicely. So the next one, and this one's a big one, the Interstate Commerce Clause. You have to realize that the Interstate Commerce Clause is actually part of a larger clause here. This is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, and it says, the Congress shall have power to, as a quick side note for a moment, as you read through the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, you'll notice every one of those clauses begins with the word to do this, and then to do that, to do this, to do that. All of those, just insert in your mind, the Congress shall have power to do each of those in Article 1, Section 8. So clause number 3, Congress shall have power to, and then we jump down to clause 3, regulate commerce. And then it talks about 3 areas they can regulate commerce. You can regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. That's a power of commerce. I'd really call it the Commerce Clause, which specifies 3 different areas. But it's this one right here that they refer to as the Interstate Commerce Clause, commerce among the several states. And from that little phrase, I'm amazed what they've created. Back in the late 1930s, Congress decided that by this Interstate Commerce Clause, they have the power to regulate anything that happens to be commerce between states. So much so that they decided we're going to help our farmers out because they're struggling. We want the farmers to be able to make a good living wage without having to work so long and hard. So what they ended up doing was passed a law that farmers cannot raise more than a certain number of tons of grain. They limited the amount of grain that farmers were allowed by federal law to raise. And by 1942, there was a U.S. Supreme Court case known as Wickard versus Filburn, where Farmer Filburn was being tried for raising more grain than allowed by federal law. And in his defense, he said, yes, I did raise that amount of grain, but I was not engaging in interstate commerce, so I'm not subject to this limitation. They said, well, why do you figure that? Well, I wasn't engaging in commerce at all. I was raising the grain for my own use and to feed my animals. I never sold it. It wasn't commerce. It wasn't intercity commerce, let alone interstate commerce. And they said, yes, it was. How do you figure? Because if you had not raised the grain, but instead had to purchase it on the interstate commerce market, you would affect the price of grain. By raising grain and not purchasing, you're also affecting interstate commerce. By not purchasing, you're affecting interstate commerce. Astounding. That's quite a stretch, but again, let's take it back to our simple test. By this interpretation, by not participating in commerce, you're affecting commerce. What can Congress not regulate? If I choose to raise a garden in my backyard and partially feed my family from it, I'm engaging in less commerce because I'm not buying as much food from the store. By that justification, then, Congress can regulate my garden in my backyard and tell me what I can and cannot grow and how much. Correct? What if I were to do some work on my own home? I want to repaint my house, for example. I'm not engaging in commerce because I'm not hiring a contractor to do it. So therefore, my not hiring can be subject to congressional control as well. And they can regulate whether or not I get to paint my own house or if I have to hire someone to do it. And some countries in Europe do that very thing today. Last example, if I choose to have children or not have children or have many children or few, all of those will affect my buying, my purchasing on the interstate commerce market. By this justification, could Congress then tell me how many children I can have or not? Would any government be so bold as to tell you how many children you can have? I guess that's already happened in other countries as well. And by this justification, they could do the same thing here under the Commerce Clause. Definitely not few and defined powers. That's unlimited government, without a doubt. But it is that same justification that is used today to justify things like our new national health care law, which is being debated whether or not it's constitutional. I tell you today clearly there's no doubt it is not authorized by those few enumerated powers of the Constitution. But just to show you what this does mean, what does this commerce power have to do with? What is the few and defined powers? Chief Justice John Marshall gives us a nice, clear description of it. He says, this power of regulation of commerce, must carry the same meaning throughout the sentence. What's he saying? Let's go back to it now. This power to regulate commerce is the same power whether it's with foreign nations or whether it's among the several states. It's the same power. Can Congress tell France, for example, that your farmers cannot raise more than a certain amount of grain? Of course not. So this power to regulate commerce with France cannot do that, then the power to regulate commerce among the states cannot do that either. Congress has no such power over foreign nations. Then they don't have the power over the states either. If it is truly the same power, and one of the things that John Marshall points out is that unless there is somewhere in the Constitution that more clearly defines that power, they are exactly the same power. Is there anywhere in the Constitution that differentiates between the power of the states here and the power over foreign nations? The answer is there is actually one place that does clarify the power. That would be found in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 5. In Article 1, Section 9, Clause 5 limits the power that Congress has over the states. Found on page 19 here, and it says, no tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. So it's saying that Congress does not have the power to allow any taxes or duties on trade between the states. What power do they have with foreign nations? That's the only power they have with foreign nations. They can't tell France what they can do and what they can't do with their commerce. All they can do is put a tariff or impost or duty, meaning product coming from France, 10% tariff as it crosses our border. That's the only power that Congress has over foreign trade. And what it says here in Article 1, Section 9 is that power is forbidden between the states. The only thing they can do with foreign countries, they cannot do with the states. In fact, it's their duty to make sure that there are no tariffs between the states. Now, the reason they did that was prior to the U.S. Constitution. Under the Articles of Confederation, there were heavy tariffs between the states. If I wanted to transport my goods from, say, up in Rhode Island down through Massachusetts to some of the southern states, Massachusetts especially was guilty of this. They charged huge tariffs for anything crossing through their state. So much so that it was cheaper to buy products from Great Britain than it was from each other, because we put such heavy duties and tariffs on each other. And so that was the vision here in Article 1, Section 9, was to prohibit such things. So today we're taught that this power of commerce, power over the states, is an unlimited power. Originally it was actually virtually no power. The only power that was there was preventing tariffs. And with the foreign nations, they could apply tariffs. Now, just to prove that I'm not making this up, President James Monroe said exactly the same thing in 1822. He says, "A power then to impose such duties and imposts in regard to foreign nations, and to prevent any on the trade between the states, was the only power granted." You'll find that's one of the answers on your sheet here. Number 7, a power then to impose such duties and imposts, and to prevent any on the trade between the states. That's the entire sum of the power of Commerce Clause, interstate and international commerce. The last one, treaty law. I've seen many emails about Secretary of State Hillary Clinton working on a treaty that would ban small arms from we the people owning them. Trying to create...
As a reminder for those watching this, this is an older video, and so that's why he's mentioning Secretary Hillary Clinton at this point.
Some kind of a gun ban with the United Nations and passing it as a treaty. And we're told that if the President and 2/3 of the Senate pass this treaty, it would override the Constitution. Now again, I'm sorry, but I have a hard time believing that one. Here's what the treaty clause says. This is actually part of the Supremacy Clause in Article 6, Clause 2. It says, "This Constitution and all treaties made or which shall be made." And then you want to skip over this part because if you read it, you might understand it. And then, "shall be the supreme law of the land." And that's what we're told the treaty law is about. Whatever is passed as a treaty is supreme, period. And you're probably coming to recognize my pattern here. The part that's left out is the part that helps you understand the true meaning. What it says there is, "All treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be supreme." Under the authority, what authority? Where is this authority granted? Oh yes, in the Constitution, that's right. So, all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States. Now you notice this one was worded a little bit different than the Supremacy Clause one, which said made in pursuance thereof. And the question's been raised sometimes in my classes, so why did they not just simply say in pursuance thereof? At this time, they already had on the books a number of treaties that were made not under the authority of the Constitution, but under the authority of the Articles of Confederation. And they didn't want this to strike down those treaties. This recognizes the authority that they were made under at the time. Those treaties that were made under the Articles of Confederation was the authority of the United States at that time. Once the Constitution was adopted, all new treaties must comply with the new authority, which is the Constitution. Now again, I'm not making such things up. I want to demonstrate to you now a couple different places that show what the treaty law really means. First of all, another great quote, Thomas Jefferson says, "I say the same as to the opinion of those who consider the grant of the treaty-making power as boundless. If it is, then we have no Constitution." If the President and the Senate, with a 2/3 majority, can override anything in the Constitution with a treaty, then we don't have a Constitution. Now the next place I want to go to is a Supreme Court ruling in 1957 known as Reed versus Covert. And in this one, Here's a portion of it. It says, it would be manifestly contrary to, and then it lists 3 different things. It would be manifestly contrary to the objectives of those who created the Constitution, as well as those who were responsible for the Bill of Rights, and then lastly, let alone alien to our entire constitutional history and tradition. Pretty strong words. This is completely out of the question of anything we've ever done constitutionally, those who wrote the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and our entire history, to do what? To construe Article 6, the treaty power, as permitting the United States to exercise power under an international agreement, and here's the key phrase, without observing constitutional prohibitions. Treaties are subject to prohibitions of power of the Constitution. In other words, if Congress has no authority to restrict our right to bear arms, then they cannot do so with a treaty. Beautiful Supreme Court ruling. Every once in a while, even a blind squirrel finds a nut. The Supreme Court got it right. Today, we have the federal government doing many things clearly outside the bounds of their power, such as, where's the power for foreign aid, federal housing programs, or education? There should be no Department of Education. Transportation, in particular the TSA, has had a lot of press, for good reason. Department of Energy, not authorized by the Constitution either. What about federal government taking from the states and the people vast areas of land to designate as wilderness areas? They're not given that power either. Wildlife, that's not within the jurisdiction of the federal government. And of course, health care. Unfortunately, this list could be far larger of things they are doing that they shouldn't be. But we don't have the time to go into all of that. But so often I get asked the question, but some of these things the federal government's doing that are not on your list here are so needed. It's for a good cause. We just have to do good in this Department of Education and helping our children have good educations or whatever. Whether we could debate back and forth whether or not they're even accomplishing that. But when we talk about this, it's for a good cause, so therefore we need to ignore the Constitution. George Washington, in his farewell address in 1796, gave us a warning on this topic. He said, if, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of constitutional powers, the way we set up the Constitution, is in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way in which the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation, for though this in one instance may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. Again, we let them take one step outside the bounds of the Constitution, they now have boundless fields of power. There's no logical place to rein them in. So, remember the brake pads that weren't changed out on the car. There are many duties Congress has given that they are not fulfilling today. They should never allow our troops to go to war and fund a war unless they have actually debated and declared a war. We'll talk about that in Lecture 4. They need to also fulfill their duty to repel an invasion. They're only supposed to raise armies, not maintain an army on an ongoing basis, which is interesting. We'll talk about that in Lecture 4 as well. Power to coin money we'll talk about next time in Lecture 3, which they're not fulfilling that duty. They're supposed to organize state militia, and what we have today in Lecture 4 will clearly define the difference between what we do have and what the constitutional militias are supposed to be. Very different. Impeachment of judges. They do that occasionally, but I can tell you there are many judges that need to be impeached. One particular one recently, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, declared, I really look more to international law than I do to the U.S. Constitution for my rulings. She then admitted she probably violated her oath of office in the process. Yes, you did, and yes, you should be impeached. And yet we're told judges are appointed for life. That's not what the Constitution says. It doesn't give any term of limit of how long they can serve, but it does say during times of good behavior. Good behavior. And if not, then they should be impeached. Well, I would say that openly admitting you're violating your oath of office is not good behavior, if ever there was bad behavior. And this is the final one that so many of our elected officials are ignoring, is their duty to uphold their oath of office, to actually follow the limits of power of the Constitution. The only way we can get back to the Constitution then, the power is really in us and our states. It's up to the states and the people to rein in the federal government. James Madison points out in Federalist number 44 There's a reason why our state level officials are required to swear an oath of office not just to their state constitution, but also to the federal constitution. At the end of Federalist 44, he addresses this question. In his answer, he says, the members and officers of the state governments will have the essential agency in giving effect to the Constitution, making it effective. Is the Constitution today effective in reining in our federal government? I'm afraid not. And if that's the case, who's to blame? Primarily, it's our state level officials, but secondarily, it's we the people not holding them accountable for holding the federal government accountable. And that's the way the power process works. That's the way the Constitution was formed. We the people empowered the states. The states then formed the Constitution. And that's the same way we rein it in. So nullification is the topic that we started off with. And that's really where we need to conclude then. To dispel the myths, nullification is not some kind of a seditious act or rebellion or treason against the federal government. It's not lawlessness. We're not seceding from the Union. It's not even civil disobedience. It's actually obeying the law. It's upholding the Constitution. When our state level officials, our governors, our state legislators, our sheriffs, and so on, are faced with a decision, do I follow the federal government or do I follow the Constitution? Which one did they swear an oath to? Clearly it was the Constitution. The only way we can see this happen then is if our state level officials will understand and apply this. Thomas Jefferson tells us that the several states who formed the instrument of the Constitution have the unquestionable right to judge of its infraction, and a nullification by those sovereignties, the states, of unauthorized acts done under the color of that instrument is the rightful remedy. If this were not the case, he tells us, without this right, they would be under the dominion, absolute and unlimited, of whosoever might exercise the right of judgment for them. Who are we told today has the right to judge if something is constitutional or not? Only the Supreme Court. Well, that would put us under the dominion, absolute and unlimited, according to Jefferson, of the Supreme Court. And that is partially where we are already today. So what we need in order to make this work is governors, first and foremost, who are willing to stand by their oath of office, who understand the importance of giving effect to the Constitution. And then a majority of state legislators who understand and will back him on that. It doesn't take every state legislator. But even one governor isn't really enough. If you have one state that stands up to the federal government, they generally are bullied into submission. A classic example of this was the Real ID Act of 2005, which was the establishment of a national ID card, which was very invasive into personal information that they were wanting to collect on a national database. Many states were very opposed to it. Here in Montana, where I'm from, our own state legislature passed a bill saying we will not, under any circumstances, implement the Real ID Act. And our governor signed it. And shortly we found that we were standing with 12 states, standing together. And with that, the federal government backed down and said, we'll give you some more time to implement this. By the time that next deadline came up, 28 states were standing together saying, we will not implement this. And they've since put it to the back burner. Now they're trying to implement it piecemeal through our Department of Motor Vehicles, but that's another matter. The point is, we stop that bad law by states standing together. And that's the only way that we can truly rein in the federal government is first with the states, and then secondarily, we need to replace Congress with those that will stand by their oath of office as well. And ultimately, the responsibility for all of that does rest with us, with we the people. The only reason they get away with what they are right now, how many people understand what we've covered today? If you were to do a survey around your community, how many people could tell you what the powers are and are not under the general welfare, under the Commerce Clause, and so on? How many people in Washington could? I find even there, they're often simply just ignorant of it. Some of them do willfully disobey it, but I think many of them are just ignorant of their limits of power. And if this becomes common knowledge again, then we the people can rein in our government back to what they're actually supposed to be doing. preserving our liberty and reining in the federal budget, at least 80% eventually. So with that, that will conclude our lecture on the Constitution, enumerated versus unlimited power. And in the next lecture, we'll go into some of the specifics of the power, monetary power, and further lectures on the war powers in lecture number 4. Thank you for joining us today.
Uh-oh. There we go.
Can't hear anything.
I'm sorry. I did not unmute myself. I unmuted everybody else. Welcome, Hootie, and thanks for watching. And you've all been unmuted, so you all can see. You can all. We can hear you right now. And what I'm going to do, and thanks for sticking with us. We're gonna start the next class at 1 o'clock, but we're gonna go through the quiz questions real quick. And what I was wanting to do, and I don't want to share a screen here. Let's see. I'm using Zoom software, and so just bear with me here as I figure this out here. I want to show everybody the quiz questions. So give me just a minute here to get these quiz questions up.
Excuse me 1 second, Evan.
Yes, go ahead. Okay. Okay, here we go. Questions for lecture 2. We just finished 2. There's 6 quiz lectures, or there's 6 lectures, 6 quizzes with those 6 lectures. Okay, so the supremacy clause. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be blank, 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 shall be supreme law of the land. So this is Article 6, Clause 2, the supremacy clause. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be blank, 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 shall be the supreme law of the land. Anybody know the answer to this quiz question?
Constitution and the laws of the United States shall be.
Okay, the answer is made in pursuance thereof. The Constitution and the laws of the United States shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land. That is the most important thing I think you can learn from this lecture. And why is that? Most lawyers will argue to you that the supremacy clause gives your congressman full authority to do whatever he or she wants as a congressman. And they'll say, well, if the supremacy clause gives them that right to do what they want. And what you have to remind them is these 4 words, made in pursuance thereof. The Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land. And so those are 4 key words when talking to them, that when we say made in pursuance of, they can only make laws that are in pursuance of the U.S. Constitution. If they're not in pursuance of the Constitution, they're no law at all. Okay, question number 2. This regards to the general welfare clause found in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. If Congress can do whatever in their discretion can be done by money and will promote the general welfare, the government is blank, 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 blank. So there's 5 words there. If Congress can do whatever in their discretion can be done by money and will promote the general welfare, the government is the answer is no longer a limited one. This is what James Madison says. He said this in 1792. If Congress can do whatever in their discretion can be done by money and will promote the general welfare, the government is no longer a limited one. It's what we're seeing today in America. The government is no longer limited. Why? Because we as Americans don't have this knowledge anymore of what this US Constitution means. And if we're only going to get our country back if we understand this US Constitution. Number 3, Congress has not unlimited powers to provide for the general welfare, but only those
Specified in the Constitution.
almost. The words are specifically enumerated. So Congress has not limited powers to provide for the general welfare, but only those specifically enumerated. That was said by Thomas Jefferson. So important. This also has to do with the general welfare clause, number 4. The 2 categories of enumerated powers found in Article 1, Section 8 are blank blank and blank blank. The 2 categories of enumerated powers found in Article 1, Section 8 are blank blank and blank blank.
To make laws.
They're all lawmaking powers, but there's 2 categories of these powers.
Categories. Oh,
Common, one of them starts with the word common.
Common
common
defense,
defense.
There you go. And the other one starts with general.
general welfare.
There you go. Those are the 2 categories of enumerated powers, common defense and general welfare.
Right.
And that's why if we go back to number 3, what Thomas Jefferson said here, Congress has not unlimited powers to provide for the general welfare, but only those enumerated. So to look for those that are enumerated, all you have to do is go to Article 1, Section 8 and identify the enumerated general welfare powers, okay? Okay, we're on to the elastic clause. Remember, there's 5 excuses for these congressmen on why they don't obey the Constitution. They use the supremacy clause, the general welfare clause, the elastic clause, the commerce clause, and treaty law as their reasons for doing whatever they want with the Constitution, okay?
Right.
So here we are at the elastic clause, and that is AKA the necessary and proper clause. That's what these congressmen will often call it too. So it's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. And here it is, number 5. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper, blank, 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 blank.
I have no idea.
It's okay if you don't have any idea. These are tough questions,
Oh, yeah.
but these should be, we should understand these as Americans. The Congress
Absolutely.
shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. And this is so important to know. For carrying into execution the foregoing powers.
Yeah.
Foregoing is such an important word in that sentence. And that's what's going to hold your congressman accountable if he or she uses the elastic clause as their reasoning for doing whatever they want to do as a congressman. Okay, let's move on to the Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. The power to regulate commerce must carry the blank blank throughout the sentence and remain a unit unless there be some plain, intelligible cause which alters it. The power to regulate commerce must carry the blank blank throughout the sentence and remain a unit unless there be some plain intelligible cause which alters it. This is by Chief Justice John Marshall in Gibbons versus Ogden, 1824. The answer there is same meaning. So the power to regulate commerce must carry the same meaning throughout the sentence.
Oh, that's right.
and remain a unit unless there be some plain intelligible cause which alters it. What we're giving you here are all the answers to your congressman's. If your congressman disobeys the Constitution, this is how you reply back to him, okay? Number 7, a power then to impose such blank in regard to foreign nations and to blank blank on the trade between the states was the only power granted. This is by President James Monroe in 1822. Does anybody know the answer to this? A power then to impose such blank in regard to foreign nations and to blank blank on the trade between the states was the only power granted.
Import is first.
Close. Duties and imposts.
Yeah, that's right.
A power then to impose such duties and imposts in regards to foreign nations and to prevent any on the trade between the states was the only power granted. That's the only power granted in the Commerce Clause. And President James Monroe said it very well in 1822. A power then to impose such duties and imposts in regard to foreign nations and to prevent any on the trade between the states was the only power granted. And this is so important because those that are trying to call an Article 5 convention are saying we need to reword the Commerce Clause. And this is the truth. President James Monroe's quote right here explains the Commerce Clause the way it's written. And if the people trying to call this Article 5 convention just understood that the Commerce Clause means this and that we don't need to change it, maybe that would get some of them to realize that we don't need an Article 5 convention. We just need to get our congressmen to obey the U.S. Constitution as it's currently written. They'll do way more damage to the Constitution than they'll do good if they call this Article 5 Constitutional Convention. Okay, on to treaty law. Number 8, it would be manifestly contrary to the objectives of those who created the Constitution, as well as those who were responsible for the Bill of Rights, let alone alien to our entire constitutional history and tradition, to construe Article 6 as permitting the United States to exercise power under an international agreement without observing blank blank. And this is a Supreme Court ruling here. Reed versus Covert, 1957. The answer is constitutional prohibitions. I'm going to reread that. It would be manifestly contrary to the objectives of those who created the Constitution, as well as those who were responsible for the Bill of Rights, let alone alien to our entire constitutional history and tradition, to construe Article 6 as permitting the United States to exercise power under an international agreement without observing constitutional prohibitions. And I've heard this from lawmakers before. Treaty law gives us the ability to, if we create a treaty that means that overrules the U.S. Constitution. No, it does not. You can never use, if you create a treaty, it has to abide by the U.S. Constitution. It cannot
Yes, sir.
be treaty law if it does not adhere to the constitutional prohibitions. Okay, and the last one here, number 9, and this has to do with amendments versus usurpation. If, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates. But let there be no change by usurpation, for though this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are
Preserved.
Established.
Nope. It starts with a D. The word is destroyed. If you'll, in George Washington, in his farewell address in 1796, he's basically saying here, if you allow this one time, it could be seen as an instrument of good, but this is the customary weapon by which governments are destroyed.
Right.
And so if so
what they're
if
doing now.
if the Constitution, if something needs to be changed, add an amendment to it. Don't usurp it, because if you usurp it, even if it may be an instrument of good, it becomes a customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. Okay, and
That's a
the
good
last
one.
thing I want to talk about here is what James Madison said in Federalist number 44. Okay. The members and officers of the state governments, this is what he said, the members and officers of the state governments will have the essential agency in giving effect to the federal Constitution. So if you live in South Carolina, our state representatives and state senators and our governor should give effect to the federal Constitution by listening to James Madison. And here's an example of that long ago. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, was first established by presidential executive order. Later, when it was ruled that the president did not have the authority to legislate such power, Congress reestablished the EPA because they do have the power to legislate, even though such an act is outside the enumerated powers of Congress. The EPA is not authorized by the Constitution, no matter if it was established by presidential executive order or by an act of Congress. Question: how might our state governments give effect to the federal Constitution on this matter? So when it comes to the Environmental Protection Agency, an unconstitutional organization, how might our state governments give effect to the federal Constitution on this matter? Anybody know the answer, or just want to see if they have the answer? Well, I live in the state of South Carolina. What should my state do to the EPA?
Get rid of it.
Yeah,
No,
we have a duty not to comply. We have a duty to say, EPA, if you're employed by the EPA, you cannot be in the state of South Carolina.
Right.
That is our duty as South Carolinians, because it is an unconstitutional agency. We, the people, never gave the federal government the authority to create the EPA. And guess what? This would save the United States government billions of dollars right there. Maybe trillions in the long run. So anyways, that DVD right there, lecture 2, and just, if you're watching this can all be found on YouTube. Just type in "The Constitution is the Solution." You can rewatch these. You can watch these as many times as you want. If you want the lecture material, which I'm using right now, you can download that from shopjbs.org. You just have to pay for the material, and you can get it from shopjbs.org. These live videos are also going to be saved on Facebook and Twitter and on my YouTube channel. My name's Evan Mulch. You can easily rewatch them on my YouTube channel. So my name's spelled EVANMULCH. And we are going to start again at 1 o'clock today. That's 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to start lecture 3. So we'll finish 3 and 4 between 1 and 3 p.m. And then we'll start with lecture 5 and 6 at 3:30 p.m. and we'll end at 5:30 p.m. So 1 o'clock we'll be starting again. Thanks everybody for being on. If you want to call me in the meantime, if you have questions, call me at 864-804-0789. Again, that's 864-804-0789. And thank you for watching this, and feel free to call or text me. I appreciate it. Talk to you later.
Right. Thank you, Evan.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Evan. Good thing.
You're welcome, Peggy.